The auctioneer's hammer fell with a hollow thud that echoed through the cramped courthouse basement. "Sold to the lady in the back for $2. Margaret Chen stepped forward, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled bills. At 73, the Vietnam War nurse had just purchased what everyone called the cursed mine, a flooded pit that had claimed 3 lives and bankrupted 2 mining companies in the past decade. The other bidders snickered as they filed out. "Crazy old bat," someone muttered. "That hole's been nothing but trouble since 1987. Margaret ignored them, her fingers instinctively reaching for the dog tags that still hung beneath her faded flannel shirt. She had learned long ago that the most valuable things in life were often the ones others threw away. If you're already feeling that chill down your spine, drop a mine in the comments so I know you're ready to dig deep into this story with me. Hit that subscribe button because what Margaret's about to discover will change everything you think you know about giving up. The courthouse clerk handed her a manila envelope containing the deed, his expression a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Ma'am, you do realize this property has been underwater for 15 years. The pumping costs alone would bankrupt most folks." Margaret nodded, tucking the envelope into her worn leather purse. She had read every geological survey, every insurance claim, every newspaper article about the Blackwater mine. What she hadn't told anyone was why she really wanted it. Outside, the October rain drummed against the courthouse steps like artillery fire. Margaret's German shepherd Luna waited patiently by the truck, her intelligent brown eyes tracking every movement. The dog had been her constant companion for 8 years, ever since Margaret had found her as a starving puppy behind a VA hospital dumpster. Now Luna's ears perked up as Margaret approached, sensing the electric tension that always preceded her owner's most important decisions. "Well, girl," Margaret whispered, scratching behind Luna's ears, "looks like we're about to find out if I'm brave or just foolish." She pulled out a yellowed photograph from her wallet, a picture of 5 young soldiers standing beside a military transport truck, their faces bright with the invincibility of youth. 4 of the faces had been carefully circled in red ink over the years. Only one remained unmarked. The drive to the mine took 47 minutes through winding mountain roads that grew narrower with each mile. Margaret had made this journey exactly once before, 36 years ago, when she was still young enough to believe that some wounds could heal with time. The trees pressed closer to the road now, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate. Luna sat alert in the passenger seat, her nose twitching at scents that grew stranger as they climbed higher into the mountains. When they finally reached the mine entrance, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The chain-link fence was exactly as she remembered, though rust had claimed most of the warning signs. Beyond it, the flooded pit stretched like a dark mirror, reflecting nothing but grey sky and the skeletal remains of mining equipment that jutted from the water, like the ribs of some prehistoric beast. But it wasn't the sight that made her hands shake as she cut through the fence with bolt cutters. It was the sound. Even after all these years, she could still hear it, the faint echo of voices calling from somewhere deep beneath the surface, voices that had haunted her dreams since 1987. Margaret had told herself for decades that it was just the wind, just the settling of metal and stone. But as Luna suddenly began to whine and pace along the water's edge, her hackles raised and her eyes fixed on something Margaret couldn't see, the old nurse realized that some secrets refused to stay buried, and this mine was about to give up the biggest secret of all. Luna's behavior grew more erratic as the days passed. The German shepherd would disappear for hours, always returning muddy and exhausted, her paws caked with a strange reddish clay that Margaret had never seen before. On the 3rd morning, Margaret followed her dog's path through the underbrush, her arthritic knees protesting with each step down the steep embankment. The trail led to a section of the mine's perimeter that the geological surveys had marked as structurally unsound, a polite way of saying the ground could collapse at any moment. Here, Luna had been digging. Not the random holes of a bored dog, but methodical excavations that formed a pattern. Margaret's military-trained eye recognized immediately. The dog was following something that ran in a straight line toward the flooded pit. Margaret knelt beside the largest hole, her fingers sifting through the displaced earth. Mixed in with the clay and rock fragments were pieces of corroded metal, too regular in shape to be natural. She pulled out what looked like a piece of aluminum tubing, its surface etched with numbers that made her blood run cold. US Army 1987, the same year the mine had flooded, the same year her nightmares had begun. That evening, Margaret sat in her trailer at the mine's edge, the metal fragment turning over and over in her weathered hands. Luna lay at her feet, but even in sleep the dog's legs twitched as if she were still digging. Margaret opened her laptop, a concession to modern life that her nephew had insisted upon, and began searching through military databases she hadn't accessed in decades. The records she found made her stomach clench with a familiar dread. In October 1987, a military transport convoy had gone missing during a routine supply run through these mountains. 5 soldiers, including the driver, had simply vanished without a trace. The official report blamed mechanical failure and poor weather conditions. The families had been told their loved ones' bodies were unrecoverable, lost somewhere in the wilderness. Margaret stared at the screen until her eyes burned, but she already knew what she would find. The convoy's manifest listed Sergeant James Morrison as the driver, the unmarked face in her photograph, the man whose letters had stopped coming 36 years ago, the soldier she had been planning to marry when the war ended. She had spent decades believing that James had simply moved on, found someone younger, someone who hadn't seen the things she had seen in the field hospitals of Vietnam. The returned letters marked addressee unknown had convinced her that he wanted nothing to do with his past, nothing to do with her. But now, as Luna whined softly in her sleep and the metal fragment grew warm in Margaret's palm, she understood the terrible truth. James hadn't abandoned her. He had never made it home at all. The next morning brought a discovery that would shatter everything Margaret thought she knew about the mine's flooding. Luna had dug deeper during the night, and at the bottom of her latest excavation lay something that made Margaret's hands shake so violently she nearly dropped her flashlight. It was a military dog tag, the metal blackened with age, but the engraving still legible. Morrison, James A. But that wasn't what made Margaret sink to her knees in the mud, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. It was what lay beneath the dog tag, a human skull, its empty socket staring up at her, with an accusation that had waited 36 years to be heard. The mine hadn't flooded by accident. Someone had deliberately destroyed the pumping equipment, sealing the pit and everything in it beneath tons of water and debris. Someone who knew exactly what they were hiding down there in the dark. And as Margaret cradled James's dog tag against her chest, Luna's urgent barking echoing across the water, she realized that whoever had killed her fiancé and his fellow soldiers was still out there, and they had no idea that their carefully buried secret was about to claw its way back to the surface. Margaret's hands shook as she photographed the skull with her phone, the flash illuminating bone that had been hidden for over 3 decades. Luna continued her frantic digging, as if she understood the magnitude of what they had uncovered. But as Margaret tried to process the horror of finding James's remains, a new sound cut through the mountain silence, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. She scrambled up the embankment, her heart pounding as a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the mine's entrance. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, their movements too coordinated, too purposeful to be casual visitors. Margaret recognized the type immediately from her years treating wounded soldiers, who spoke in hushed tones about missions that officially never happened. "Mrs. Chen?" The taller man's voice carried across the clearing with military precision. "I'm Agent Harrison, FBI. We need to talk." He held up a badge, but something about his posture, the way his partner's hand rested near his jacket, told Margaret these men weren't here to help her find justice. They were here to bury the truth even deeper. Margaret's mind raced as she walked toward them, Luna growling low at her side. How had they known she was here? How had they known what she had found? Unless someone had been watching the mine all these years, waiting for exactly this moment. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Beautiful day for a drive in the mountains. We understand you've been doing some excavation work," Harrison continued, his eyes scanning the disturbed earth around Luna's dig sites. "This is a dangerous area, Mrs. Chen. Unstable ground, contaminated water. We're here for your own safety." His partner moved closer to the excavation site, and Margaret saw him speak quietly into a radio. Whatever they were planning, backup was coming. Funny thing about safety, Margaret replied, her fingers closing around James's dog tag in her pocket. I spent 2 years in Vietnam patching up boys who were told they were safe right before the mortars started falling. You develop a sense for when someone's lying to you. Luna's growling intensified, and Margaret could see the intelligence in her dog's eyes. Luna knew these men were a threat. Harrison's facade cracked slightly. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to need you to come with us. There are some questions about your purchase of this property, some irregularities in the paperwork. He stepped forward, and Margaret caught a glimpse of the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. These weren't FBI agents conducting a routine investigation. These were cleaners, sent to eliminate a problem that had suddenly become too big to ignore. You know what I find interesting? Margaret said, backing slowly toward her truck, while Luna positioned herself between the men and her owner. I've been researching this mine for months, and there's no record of any federal investigation. No environmental surveys, no safety inspections. It's almost like someone wanted this place forgotten. She could see the calculation in Harrison's eyes. The moment when he decided talking was no longer an option. The first shot shattered the truck's windshield as Margaret dove behind the vehicle, Luna leaping after her with reflexes honed by years of survival. But Margaret had survived worse than this. She had crawled through rice paddies under enemy fire, had performed surgery while artillery shells exploded overhead. 2 fake federal agents weren't going to stop her from finally learning the truth about James's death. As bullets sparked off the truck's metal frame, Margaret's military training kicked in. She pulled out her phone and hit record, then slid it into Luna's collar. If she didn't survive this, at least someone would know what really happened here. Go, girl, she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. Find help. Luna hesitated for a heartbeat, her brown eyes meeting Margaret's, then disappeared into the forest like a shadow. The shooting stopped abruptly, replaced by urgent radio chatter. Margaret could hear Harrison cursing, his partner arguing about complications and exposure. They hadn't expected resistance. They had thought they were dealing with a harmless old woman who would disappear quietly. Just another unfortunate accident at the cursed mine. But as Margaret crouched behind her bullet-riddled truck, James's dog tag warm against her palm, she made a promise that would have made her younger self proud. She was going to survive this. She was going to expose whoever had murdered 5 soldiers and spent 36 years covering it up. And she was going to make sure that James Morrison and his fellow soldiers finally got the justice they deserved. The question was whether Luna could reach help before Harrison and his partner decided that loose ends needed to be permanently tied up. Luna ran through the mountain forest with the desperate speed of a creature who understood that time was running out. The German shepherd's powerful legs carried her down trails that seemed to exist only in her memory, following scents and sounds that led her toward the distant highway. Margaret's phone bounced against her collar with each stride, its screen recording everything, the gunshots echoing behind them, the shouted commands of men who had revealed their true nature. Meanwhile, Margaret used the temporary lull in gunfire to examine her surroundings with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in Vietnam. The mine's layout offered limited cover, but she noticed something the geological surveys had missed: a drainage tunnel that disappeared into the hillside, partially concealed by decades of overgrowth. If she could reach it, she might be able to escape through the mountain's underground network. Mrs. Chen! Harrison's voice carried a false note of concern. We know you're hurt. Let us help you. Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity. She had seen what their kind of help looked like: a shallow grave and another accident report. Instead, she began crawling toward the tunnel entrance, using the truck as cover while her mind pieced together the conspiracy that had claimed James's life. The military convoy hadn't been carrying routine supplies in 1987. Margaret remembered now. James's last letter had mentioned a special assignment, something that required absolute secrecy. What if they had been transporting something valuable enough to kill for? Something worth flooding an entire mine to hide? You're probably wondering if Margaret will make it out alive, and honestly, the next few minutes will determine everything. Drop a run in the comments if you think she should head for that tunnel, or fight if she should stand her ground. Your choice might just influence how this story ends. Harrison and his partner were moving now, their footsteps crunching through the gravel as they approached Margaret's position. She could hear them coordinating their search, professional and methodical. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated a woman who had spent her life saving lives under impossible circumstances. Margaret reached the tunnel entrance just as Harrison rounded the truck's rear bumper. For a moment, their eyes met across the 20 feet of open ground. She saw the recognition in his face, the understanding that she wasn't going to surrender quietly. Then she was rolling into the darkness of the drainage tunnel, her body protesting every movement, but her spirit burning with a fury that had been building for 36 years. The tunnel was narrower than she had hoped, forcing her to crawl on her belly through decades of accumulated debris. Behind her, she could hear Harrison shouting into his radio, calling for backup and heavy equipment. They would try to seal the tunnel, trap her underground like they had trapped James and his convoy. But Margaret had one advantage they couldn't account for. She knew these mountains. As a young nurse, she had explored every cave and crevice within 50 miles of the base hospital, seeking solitude and peace between the waves of wounded soldiers. The drainage system connected to a network of natural caves that emerged miles away, near the old logging road. If she could reach that exit before Harrison's backup arrived, she might have a chance. The tunnel began to slope downward, and Margaret could hear the sound of running water ahead. The mine's flooding had created an underground river that carried the mountain's runoff toward the valley below. She would have to follow that water, trust it to lead her to safety. But as she crawled deeper into the darkness, her fingers brushing against something metallic embedded in the tunnel wall, Margaret realized she had found more than just an escape route. She had found the evidence that would finally expose the truth about James's murder. The metallic object was another piece of military equipment, this one bearing markings that made Margaret's blood run cold. Classified, Project Deepwater. She pulled out her phone's flashlight and photographed the fragment, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Whatever Project Deepwater had been, it was worth killing 5 soldiers to protect. And as Margaret heard the distant sound of Luna's barking echoing from somewhere far above, she knew that her dog had found help. The question was whether that help would arrive in time to prevent Harrison from sealing her underground forever. Just another casualty of a secret that had already claimed too many lives. The water was rising now, fed by the autumn rains and the mine's endless seepage. Margaret had minutes, maybe less, before the tunnel became impassable. But she also had something Harrison didn't expect: the absolute determination of a woman who had finally found the truth she had been seeking for 36 years. James Morrison was about to get his justice, even if it killed her. Luna burst onto Highway 34 like a creature possessed, her powerful frame skidding across the asphalt as she positioned herself directly in front of an oncoming pickup truck. The driver, a local contractor named Mike Reeves, slammed his brakes, his heart hammering as the German Shepherd refused to move. But it was the phone strapped to the dog's collar, its screen still recording, that made Mike realize this wasn't just a lost pet. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, watching the footage of gunshots and hearing Margaret's voice explaining about the mine, about James Morrison, about men who weren't really FBI agents. Luna barked once, sharp and urgent, then began running back toward the mountains. Mike grabbed his own phone, dialing 911 as he followed the dog in his truck, his construction experience telling him that whatever was happening up there, time was running out. Deep underground, Margaret crawled through rising water that had turned the drainage tunnel into a death trap. The current was stronger now, pulling at her clothes and threatening to sweep her into the mountain's depths. But the metallic fragments embedded in the tunnel walls told a story that made her push forward despite the danger. Project Deepwater hadn't been about mining. It had been about hiding something so valuable that 5 soldiers had died to protect its secret. Her phone's flashlight illuminated another piece of equipment, wedged between the rocks, this one bearing the distinctive markings of a radiation detector. Margaret's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. The convoy hadn't been carrying supplies or weapons. They had been transporting nuclear material, something so dangerous that the government had been willing to murder its own soldiers rather than risk exposure. The water reached her chest now, and Margaret could feel the current trying to drag her toward an underground sump that would trap her forever. But her fingers had found something else in the tunnel wall, a waterproof case, military grade, designed to survive decades underwater. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had somehow remained intact, were documents that would change everything. The first page made her hands shake so violently she nearly dropped the case. It was a transport manifest dated October 15th, 1987, signed by someone whose name she recognized from newspaper headlines. A general who had later become Secretary of Defense, a man who had built his political career on his military service and his commitment to national security. The manifest listed the cargo as spent nuclear fuel rods, destined for a classified disposal site. But the convoy had never reached its destination. According to the documents, James and his fellow soldiers had discovered that the disposal site was actually a plan to dump radioactive waste in the mine, contaminating the water supply for 3 counties. When they had refused to participate in what amounted to environmental terrorism, they had been eliminated. Margaret photographed every page with her dying phone, the water now reaching her neck as she fought against the current. The final document was a kill order, signed by the same general, authorizing the permanent resolution of the transport team. 5 young soldiers had been murdered, not by enemy action but by their own government, their bodies dumped in the mine along with the nuclear waste they had died trying to protect the public from. Above ground, Harrison was screaming into his radio as he watched Mike Reeves's pickup truck racing up the mountain road, Luna running alongside it like a 4-legged missile. "The situation is compromised. I repeat, the situation is compromised. We need immediate extraction and a full cleanup team." But even as he spoke, Harrison knew it was too late. The secret that had been buried for 36 years was about to explode into the daylight. Margaret felt the current grab her legs, pulling her toward the sump with inexorable force. But she had what she came for, proof that James Morrison and 4 other soldiers had been heroes, not casualties of war, but martyrs to their own government's corruption. She sealed the documents in her jacket's waterproof pocket and began swimming with the current instead of fighting it, trusting the mountain's underground river to carry her toward whatever exit lay ahead. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast underground chamber, and Margaret found herself treading water in what had once been the mine's deepest shaft. Above her, barely visible in the darkness, she could see the skeletal remains of mining equipment and something else. The corroded hulk of a military transport truck, its cargo bay doors hanging open like the jaws of a metal whale. This was where it had all ended, where James and his fellow soldiers had made their final stand against orders that would have poisoned thousands of innocent people, where they had been gunned down and left to rot in the darkness, their sacrifice forgotten by everyone except the men who had killed them. But as Margaret swam toward what looked like another tunnel opening, she heard something that made her heart soar with desperate hope, the distant sound of sirens growing louder with each passing second. Luna had done it. Help was coming. The question was whether Margaret could survive long enough to see justice finally served. Sheriff Janet Torres had seen a lot of strange things in her 20 years of law enforcement, but nothing had prepared her for Luna's desperate performance on Highway 34. The German Shepherd had led a convoy of police cars, paramedics, and Mike Reeves's pickup truck up the mountain road with the single-minded determination of a creature on a mission from God. When they reached the mine, the scene that greeted them looked like a war zone. Margaret's bullet-riddled truck sat abandoned near the flooded pit, its shattered windshield catching the afternoon sun like broken teeth. But it was the 2 men in expensive suits, standing over what appeared to be the entrance to a drainage tunnel, that made Torres draw her weapon. Harrison spun around as the police cars surrounded him, his hand moving toward his jacket, before he caught sight of the sheriff's rifle aimed directly at his chest. "Federal agents!" Harrison shouted, reaching for his badge. "This is a classified operation!" But Torres had been a cop long enough to recognize the difference between real federal agents and the kind of men who cleaned up messes for people who preferred to remain invisible. Real FBI agents didn't shoot up civilian vehicles and then try to seal people underground. "On the ground now," Torres commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down drug dealers and domestic terrorists without flinching. "Hands where I can see them." Harrison's partner made the mistake of reaching for his weapon, and Torres put a bullet in the dirt 6 inches from his feet. "Next one goes center mass. Your choice." Deep underground, Margaret had found her way into a natural cave system that connected to the mine's lower levels. The water here was shallower, allowing her to wade rather than swim, but the current was still strong enough to be dangerous. Her phone was dead now, its battery finally succumbing to the moisture and cold, but she had memorized every detail of the documents that proved James's innocence. The cave opened into another chamber, this one partially above water, and Margaret hauled herself onto a rocky ledge that felt like salvation. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized she wasn't alone. Scattered across the chamber floor were the remains of 5 soldiers, their bones picked clean by time and water, but their dog tags still gleaming in the faint light that filtered down from somewhere far above. Margaret gathered the tags with trembling hands, reading names she had seen on missing persons reports and casualty lists. Morrison, James A. Rodriguez, Carlos M. Washington, Deshaun T. O'Brien, Patrick K. Kim, Michael S. 5 young men who had died because they had refused to poison their own countrymen. 5 heroes whose sacrifice had been buried beneath tons of water and lies. Above her she could hear voices echoing through the mine shafts, not Harrison's cold professionalism, but the warm drawl of Sheriff Torres and the urgent calls of search and rescue teams. Luna's barking grew louder, more insistent, as if the dog could sense that Margaret was close. The German shepherd had done more than just find help. She had brought an army. Margaret began climbing toward the voices, using the corroded mining equipment as handholds, while the dog tags clinked softly in her pocket. Each step upward was a victory against the men who had tried to bury the truth, each breath a testament to the power of love that had driven her to seek justice for a man she had never stopped loving. When she finally emerged from a ventilation shaft near the mine's main entrance, the sight that greeted her was better than any homecoming she could have imagined. Sheriff Torres had Harrison and his partner in handcuffs, while Luna danced around the rescue teams with the joy of a dog who had accomplished the impossible. Mike Reeves was there too, his pickup truck serving as a command post for the growing crowd of law enforcement officers who had responded to Luna's desperate call for help. "Ma'am," Torres said, rushing to Margaret's side as paramedics wrapped her in blankets, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Margaret shook her head, her hand closing around the dog tags that represented 36 years of unanswered questions. She was tired, cold, and probably in shock, but she had never felt more alive. "I need you to contact the FBI," Margaret said, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. "The real FBI. I have evidence of a government cover-up that goes back to 1987, evidence of murder and environmental terrorism that reaches the highest levels of our military." She pulled out the waterproof case, its contents still intact despite her underground odyssey. Torres examined the documents with growing amazement, her experienced eye recognizing the authenticity of military paperwork and the devastating implications of what Margaret had discovered. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "do you realize what you've uncovered here?" Margaret nodded, scratching Luna behind the ears as the German shepherd pressed against her legs. "I've uncovered the truth," Margaret replied, looking out over the flooded mine that had hidden its secrets for so long. "And I've finally brought my boys home." But as Harrison caught her eye from the back of the police car, his expression promised that this was far from over. The conspiracy that had killed 5 soldiers and hidden nuclear waste in a mountain mine had powerful protectors, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. The real battle for justice was just beginning. Within 6 hours of Margaret's rescue, the mine had become the center of a media storm that reached from the local news stations to the Pentagon's crisis management team. Sheriff Torres had made the smart decision to contact both the FBI and the press simultaneously, knowing that publicity was Margaret's best protection against the kind of people who made problems disappear permanently. But as news vans lined the mountain road and reporters shouted questions about government cover-ups, Margaret sat in the sheriff's office, staring at 5 dog tags that represented more than just dead soldiers. They represented a truth that powerful people had killed to protect. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret despite the shared surname, arrived from Denver with a team of forensic specialists and a reputation for taking down corrupt officials regardless of their rank or political connections. Margaret watched through the office window as Agent Chen examined the documents from the waterproof case, her expression growing darker with each page. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Chen said, entering the office with the careful respect of someone who understood they were dealing with a witness whose testimony could topple governments. These documents, if they're authentic, they implicate some very powerful people in multiple felonies. Are you prepared for what that means? Margaret looked down at Luna, who had refused to leave her side since the rescue, then back at the agent. Agent Chen, I spent 2 years in Vietnam watching boys die for lies told by powerful men in Washington. I've spent 36 years believing that the man I loved abandoned me, when he actually died trying to protect innocent people from those same powerful men. Margaret's voice carried the weight of decades of pain and the steel of absolute determination. I'm not just prepared for what this means. I've been waiting my whole life for this moment. The forensic team's preliminary analysis confirmed what Margaret already knew. The documents were authentic, the radiation signatures in the mine matched the isotopes listed in the transport manifest, and the skeletal remains in the underground chamber bore evidence of gunshot wounds consistent with execution-style killings. But it was the discovery of the transport truck's black box recorder that provided the final devastating piece of evidence. James Morrison's voice, preserved for 36 years in a waterproof military recorder, told the story of 5 soldiers who had discovered their cargo's true nature and refused to participate in what their commanding officer called a necessary sacrifice for national security. The recording captured their final moments, James arguing with someone over a radio, insisting that poisoning American citizens is not what we swore to defend, followed by gunshots and the sound of rushing water as the mine's pumps were destroyed. Margaret listened to James's voice with tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication, of a love that had been proven worthy after decades of doubt. "He died a hero," she whispered to Luna, who seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They all did. But even as the evidence mounted, Margaret could see the machinery of cover-up beginning to turn. Phone calls were being made to Washington, lawyers were being summoned, and she noticed that some of the original crime scene photos had mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's files. The conspiracy that had killed 5 soldiers wasn't going to surrender without using every weapon in its considerable arsenal. That evening, as Margaret sat in a motel room under police protection, she received a phone call that chilled her blood. The voice was cultured, educated, and absolutely cold. "Mrs. Chen, my name is General Patricia Hawthorne. I believe you have something that belongs to the United States government." Margaret recognized the name from her research. Hawthorne had been a young colonel in 1987, one of the officers who had signed off on Project Deepwater. "General, I have evidence of mass murder and environmental terrorism committed by the United States government," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "And I have every intention of making sure the world knows about it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long seconds before Hawthorne spoke again. "Mrs. Chen, you're a patriot. You served your country with distinction in Vietnam. Surely you understand that some secrets must be kept for the greater good." Margaret almost laughed at the audacity. "The greater good? 5 soldiers are dead because they tried to protect American citizens from nuclear contamination. How is covering that up serving the greater good? Those soldiers died to protect a classified operation that prevented a much larger catastrophe," Hawthorne continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "If you release those documents, you'll be endangering national security and dishonoring their sacrifice." But Margaret had heard this song before, in the hospitals of Vietnam where wounded soldiers had been told their injuries were classified, their pain a matter of national security. "General Hawthorne," Margaret said, looking down at Luna, who was growling softly at the phone as if she could sense the evil on the other end. "Those soldiers died because they refused to follow illegal orders. Their sacrifice was dishonored the moment you buried them in that mine and told their families they were missing in action. I'm not endangering national security. I'm exposing war criminals." The line went dead, but Margaret knew the conversation was far from over. General Hawthorne and her allies would try everything: legal challenges, character assassination, maybe even another accident at a cursed mine. But they had made one crucial mistake 36 years ago, and they were about to make it again. They had underestimated the power of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The attack came at 3:17 a.m., not with bullets or explosives, but with something far more insidious, a complete digital assassination of Margaret's credibility. By dawn, every major news outlet was running stories about the disturbed veteran who had fabricated evidence to gain attention, citing anonymous military sources who questioned her mental stability and suggested that her Vietnam service had left her prone to paranoid delusions. Margaret watched the character assassination unfold from the sheriff's office, where Agent Chen was fielding phone calls from Washington that grew more threatening with each hour. "They're claiming the documents are forgeries," Chen explained, her frustration evident. "They're saying the radiation readings are from natural uranium deposits, and they've produced service records showing that James Morrison was discharged honorably in 1986, a full year before the alleged incident." But Margaret had been expecting this. She had seen how the government dealt with inconvenient truths, how official records could be altered and witnesses discredited. "Agent Chen," she said calmly, "ask them to explain how James Morrison could have been discharged in 1986 when I have letters from him postmarked in September 1987. She pulled out a shoebox that Luna had somehow managed to retrieve from her trailer during the chaos. Dozens of letters in James's distinctive handwriting, each one dated and postmarked. The letters told a different story than the official records. They spoke of James's growing unease with his assignments, his questions about cargo manifests that didn't match what he was actually transporting, his concerns about officers who seemed more interested in secrecy than military protocol. The final letter, dated October 10, 1987, mentioned his team's discovery of something that could hurt a lot of innocent people and his intention to do the right thing no matter what it costs. Agent Chen examined the letters with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "Mrs. Chen, these letters, they corroborate everything in the documents you found, but they're also going to paint an even bigger target on your back." Margaret nodded, scratching Luna behind the ears as the German Shepherd maintained her vigilant watch at the office window. "Agent Chen, I've been carrying a target on my back for 36 years. The only difference now is that I finally know who's been aiming at me." Margaret's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down death and discovered they were stronger than they had ever imagined. "The question is, are you going to help me expose the truth, or are you going to let them bury it again?" The answer came in the form of a convoy of black SUVs that pulled up outside the sheriff's office, disgorging a team of federal agents who looked nothing like the FBI specialists Agent Chen had brought from Denver. These men moved with military precision, their faces hidden behind sunglasses despite the overcast morning, their hands resting on weapons that were definitely not standard FBI issue. "Agent Chen," the lead man announced as he entered the office, "I'm Agent Morrison, no relation, from the Department of Homeland Security. We're here to take custody of the evidence and the witness for national security reasons." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice at the casual use of James's surname, a psychological warfare tactic designed to remind her that they could reach anyone, anywhere. But Agent Chen stood her ground with the courage of someone who had sworn an oath to uphold justice, not protect conspiracies. "I'm sorry, Agent Morrison, but this is an active FBI investigation. You'll need proper authorization from my superiors before I can release anything." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the two federal agencies faced off over evidence that could destroy careers and topple governments. Luna sensed the danger before anyone else, her growl starting low and building to a snarl that made even the armed agents step back. The German Shepherd positioned herself between Margaret and the newcomers, her intelligence recognizing that these men represented the same threat as Harrison and his partner. Margaret placed a calming hand on Luna's head, but she didn't order the dog to stand down. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, rising from her chair with the dignity of someone who had faced down worse enemies than bureaucrats with badges, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. You see, I'm not just a witness to a crime. I'm a victim of a conspiracy that murdered the man I loved and 4 other soldiers, and I'm not going anywhere until justice is served." The standoff that followed would determine whether the truth about Project Deepwater would finally see the light of day, or whether it would be buried once again beneath the weight of national security classifications and the bodies of those who dared to speak out. But as Margaret looked into Agent Morrison's cold eyes, she realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day she bought a flooded mine for $2. Some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. And some women are too stubborn to let them try. The real question was whether Luna's next move would save them all, or whether the German Shepherd was about to become the latest casualty in a war that had been raging in the shadows for 36 years. Luna's decision came with the lightning speed of a creature who had spent 8 years reading Margaret's emotions and understanding when action was required. The German Shepherd didn't attack the federal agents. Instead, she bolted for the office door with something clenched in her jaws that made Agent Morrison curse with a creativity that definitely wasn't taught at Quantico. Luna had grabbed the evidence bag containing James's dog tags and was racing toward the crowd of reporters still camped outside the sheriff's office. "Stop that dog!" Morrison shouted, but Luna was already weaving through the legs of surprised journalists, her powerful frame carrying her toward the news van with the largest satellite dish. Margaret watched through the window as her brilliant companion dropped the evidence bag directly at the feet of CNN's lead investigative reporter, then sat down and barked once, as if to say, "Here's your story." The reporter, a veteran journalist named Patricia Walsh who had built her career on exposing government corruption, immediately understood the significance of what had just been delivered to her. She held up the dog tags to the cameras, reading James Morrison's name and service number, to a live television audience that included millions of Americans and, more importantly, the families of 5 soldiers who had been told their sons were missing in action. Agent Morrison's team found themselves in the impossible position of trying to confiscate evidence that was now being broadcast live on national television. Margaret watched with grim satisfaction as Morrison spoke urgently into his radio, his carefully planned operation dissolving into chaos, as social media exploded with questions about Project Deepwater and demands for answers about the soldiers whose remains had been found in the flooded mine. "Agent Chen," Margaret said quietly, "I think it's time to release everything else." Agent Chen nodded, understanding that the moment for half measures had passed. She began uploading the documents, photographs, and audio recordings to a secure FBI server that would automatically distribute them to every major news outlet in the country if anything happened to the people who had discovered them. Within hours, the story had exploded across every platform imaginable. Batista. Project Deepwater was trending on social media. Families of the dead soldiers were demanding congressional hearings, and environmental groups were calling for immediate testing of water supplies in 3 counties. But it was the audio recording of James Morrison's final moments that truly captured the public's imagination. The voice of a young soldier choosing death over participating in what he called mass murder disguised as patriotism. Margaret found herself at the center of a media hurricane that she had never wanted but knew was necessary. She gave interviews from the sheriff's office, Luna always at her side, telling the story of a love that had endured 36 years of doubt and a conspiracy that had claimed 5 heroes. But even as she spoke to reporters and congressional investigators, Margaret could see the machinery of government damage control working overtime to contain the crisis. General Hawthorne appeared on the evening news, her uniform gleaming with decorations earned over a distinguished career, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to national service. The allegations being made by Mrs. Chen are based on fabricated documents and the delusions of a woman who has never recovered from the trauma of her wartime service, Hawthorne said, her words carefully chosen to sound compassionate while destroying Margaret's credibility. But Hawthorne had made a crucial error. She had underestimated the power of the internet and the determination of people who had spent decades searching for answers about their missing loved ones. Within minutes of her television appearance, social media was flooded with photographs, letters, and military records that contradicted every claim she had made. The families of the dead soldiers had kept everything, every official letter, every inconsistent explanation, every promise that their sons' bodies would eventually be found. Carlos Rodriguez's mother, now in her 80s, appeared on television holding a letter from the army that claimed her son had been discharged in 1986, alongside a birthday card he had sent her in October 1987. Deshaun Washington's sister produced photographs of her brother in uniform dated months after his supposed discharge. The official story was crumbling under the weight of evidence that families had preserved for decades, waiting for someone to finally listen. Margaret watched the dominoes fall with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice was finally coming for James and his fellow soldiers, but it had taken 36 years and the sacrifice of too many people who had died waiting for the truth. As she prepared for what she knew would be the final confrontation with the forces that had killed the man she loved, Margaret made a promise to Luna and to herself. She would see this through to the end, no matter what it cost her. James Morrison and his fellow soldiers would finally get the honor they deserved, and the people responsible for their deaths would face the consequences of their actions. The $2 mine had given up its secrets, but the real treasure had always been the truth. And sometimes, the truth was worth more than life itself. 6 months later, Margaret stood in Arlington National Cemetery as 5 flag-draped coffins were lowered into graves that should have been dug 36 years earlier. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, family members who had never given up hope, fellow veterans who understood the cost of service, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the story of soldiers who chose death over dishonor. Luna sat at Margaret's side, her graying muzzle a reminder that even the most loyal companions couldn't live forever. But the German shepherd's eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a job well done, a mission completed against impossible odds. She had done more than just find help that day at the mine. She had helped expose one of the most shameful cover-ups in American military history. The congressional hearings had lasted for months, with testimony that reached the highest levels of government and military command. General Hawthorne had been stripped of her rank and faced federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and environmental terrorism. 3 other high-ranking officials had been arrested, and the families of the dead soldiers had received not just the truth they had sought for decades, but compensation that could never truly make up for their loss. Agent Chen, now promoted to Deputy Director of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, had personally overseen the investigation that led to 17 indictments and the creation of new oversight protocols designed to prevent future cover-ups. She stood with Margaret at the graveside, both women understanding that justice had been served, but at a cost that neither would ever forget. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Chen said quietly, as the honor guard fired their final salute. "James would be proud of what you accomplished. They all would." Margaret nodded, her fingers closing around the wedding ring she had worn for 36 years, despite never having the chance to say, "I do." She had finally learned the truth about why James had never come home, and that truth had set them both free. The mine itself had been declared a Superfund site, its contaminated water finally being treated by the same government that had created the problem decades earlier. The cleanup would take years and cost millions of dollars, but the poisoning of 3 counties' water supply had been prevented by 5 soldiers who had paid the ultimate price for their courage. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Margaret found herself alone with Luna at James's grave. The headstone was simple, bearing his name, rank, and the dates of his birth and death, along with a single line that Margaret had insisted upon: "He chose honor over orders." It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had died defending the principles that his country claimed to represent. "You know, girl," Margaret said to Luna, scratching behind the dog's ears as they stood in the fading afternoon light, "I spent so many years thinking he had abandoned me. I never imagined that he had died trying to protect people he'd never even met." Luna looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and Margaret could swear the dog understood every word. The walk back to their car took them past the graves of thousands of other soldiers, men and women who had given their lives in service to their country. But Margaret knew that James and his fellow soldiers were different. They hadn't died fighting a foreign enemy. They had died fighting the corruption within their own ranks, the willingness of powerful people to sacrifice innocent lives for political convenience. As they reached the parking lot, Margaret was surprised to find a small crowd waiting for her. They were families of other soldiers who had died under suspicious circumstances, veterans who had questions about their own service, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by the story of a woman who had refused to give up on the truth. They wanted to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask for her help in finding answers to questions that had haunted them for years. Margaret looked down at Luna, who wagged her tail as if to say, "Well, what are you waiting for?" The German shepherd had spent 8 years helping Margaret find the truth about James's death. Maybe it was time to help other people find their own truths, to ensure that no other families had to wait 36 years for answers that should have been given freely. "I suppose," Margaret said to the crowd, "we have work to do." And as Luna barked her agreement, Margaret realized that buying a flooded mine for $2 had been the best investment she had ever made. Not because of what she had found buried in its depths, but because of what she had discovered about herself. That love could survive any betrayal, that truth could overcome any conspiracy, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on foreign soil, but in the shadows of our own government. The mine had given up its secrets, but Margaret's real treasure had always been the knowledge that James Morrison had died a hero. And now, finally, the whole world knew it too. Some stories end with justice served and wrongs made right. But the best stories end with the understanding that every ending is really just a new beginning, and that the courage to seek truth is the most valuable inheritance we can leave for those who come after us. What truths are you still searching for in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're brave enough to dig deeper than anyone thought possible.